Our next speaker is Dr. David Gordon of the Mises Institute, and he's going to be lecturing to us today on Praxeology, the Austrian method. David?
I should say this lecture is usually given by Hans Hoppe, so in case there's any confusion, I'm not Hans Hoppe. If I were to say that I am Hans Hoppe, I wouldn't be guilty of a performative contradiction, but it would nevertheless be a false statement. We've heard in the lectures various principles of economics on the law of marginal utility, how the various properties of value. We have other laws of economics, law of supply and demand. And the question that I want to address today is, how do we know that these principles of economics are true? Now, there are really two ways we can know things. One is by observation. We can use our senses and make various observations. We learn things about the world in that way. Now, of course, when we do that, we're not just restricting ourselves to observations, we're also thinking about things. Say, supposing an astronomer is trying to figure out how the planets move, he would make various observations and he'd come up with a theory that explains these observations, and then he would see whether his theory is correct. Would it account for the observations? Now, there's another way we can learn about things other than just by observation, and this is by thinking about them without using our senses to come up with new observations about the world. We just think about things. Now, some people might object to this. They say, well, don't all our concepts come by abstraction from the world? One very well-known philosophical novelist, I won't mention, but her initials are AR, holds this view. She said, well, we get our concepts through measurement omission by abstraction from our knowledge, our sensory knowledge. Now, this doesn't view whether you think that's right or not. That doesn't affect what I'm saying now, because the question I'm raising is not how do we acquire our concepts, but once we've got our concepts, how do we use those concepts to acquire knowledge? Can we just acquire knowledge just by thinking about things? That you can hold that view even if you hold that all our concepts come from by abstraction from the empirical world. Now, it would seem like, at least there are some disciplines where we can know things just by thinking about them. Mathematics is the prime example. We don't do experiments in mathematics. We just think about various properties of numbers and deduce theorems. And the view of Austrian economics, especially as developed by Ludwig von Mises, was that the way we know that economic theories or propositions about economics are true are just by thinking about them. We're not doing experiments, we're not doing observations, we're just thinking about them. And specifically, what he argued was that what we're thinking about is what follows from the concept of action. He thought that economics was part of a more general science of human action, and he called this praxeology. That's his term for the science of human action. This was a term he came up with, wasn't the original term he used in his essays in Epistemological Problems of Economics. which came out in the 1930s, he called this discipline sociology, but that's not such a good name for it because that's really a different discipline. So then he decided to come up with, he decided to call it praxeology instead. So praxeology is a science of human action, and it uses this distinct method of thinking about the notion of action and what follows from that. Now, when I say thinking about this isn't deduction in the formal sense in which you can put symbols on the board and then come up with rules by which you derive various propositions from those symbols. The view rather is that we all have a knowledge of action since we ourselves are actors. We do things, and action is any use of a means to achieve ends. Say, I'm giving a lecture, that's an action, or you're not walking out, at least not yet. That would be another action. So an action is any means to achieve an end. And this is something that seems like an unquestionable starting point where it's given to us that we act. There are people who denied this. Murray Rothbard used to tell a story that when he was teaching at Brooklyn Polytechnic, he was once asked to give a lecture to the whole faculty on Austrian Economics, and he started from the action axiom that human beings act. And he said a lot of people were questioning that. They thought this was pretty controversial. They didn't want to grant that people act. And in fact, there's one school of psychology and philosophy, the behaviorists, who deny that people act, or at least they say that the mind isn't really necessary to explain human behavior. All we have is certain kinds of behavior that the notion that praxeology has it, where we're having a purpose, that we have it as the end of our action. We're using a means to achieve an end, to achieve a certain purpose. This isn't really useful in science. We should get rid of this. It's like, the old story of one behaviorist who meets another on the street and said to him, "You're fine, how am I?" Yes, I'm glad you laughed at that. I told that joke to Hayek in 1969. He laughed at it, so I'm glad you laughed. But so I think we can say that, aside from this small group of dissenters, it's a reasonable starting point that human beings act. And if we think about the concept, what's involved in action according to Mises and his followers, we can come up with some very important results. Now, one example of this is a fundamental principle that Mises called methodological individualism. Okay, now this is the methodological individualism is a principle that only individuals act. We can have, say, we're talking about a nation doesn't really act. It's only individuals who are acting. If we're talking about, let's say we say something like Germany invaded Russia on June 22nd, 1941. It isn't that there is a collective entity, Germany, that was acting on its own and doing something. It's rather that there are individuals who were acting. Hitler gave certain orders, and as a result of this, all sorts of individuals started acting. The view isn't that, methodological individualism isn't that only individuals exist, that it doesn't make sense to talk about nations or collective bodies existing. It's just that individuals are the only ones who act. I should say one of my favorite humorous writers, Oscar Levant, once noticed a kind of a linguistic peculiarity here. We could say, quite probably say, Germany invaded Russia or Hitler invaded Russia, but we couldn't say Germany invaded Stalin or Hitler invaded Stalin. So, I'm not sure why that's true, but it is interesting. Now, if we ask, how do we know that only individuals act? How does this follow from the axiom that human beings act? How do we get only human beings act? You'll see it doesn't follow in any formal sense. I mean, if you just wrote it, somehow symbolized human beings act, you wouldn't be able to get from this only human beings act. Rather, you think about what's involved in the concept. It's sort of the assumption is we have a conceptual understanding of action, and from this we can see that only individuals act. This is a very significant view because there are influential theories that have denied this. Let's say, for example, in Marxism, which is still an extremely important view, especially in English departments of American universities, at least according to one interpretation of Marx, and this is the one that Mises talked about in Theory and History, the forces of production in society, by which Marx meant roughly speaking, the technology that's available to a society, has a tendency to grow on its own. There's a sort of constant tendency of the forces of production to develop in history. In this view, he's violating this principle of methodological individualism because he's saying that it's really the forces of production have this tendency to develop on their own. They're developing. The individuals are just the instruments of this forces of production. So you can see, if you accept Mises' methodological individualism, you right away have a refutation of a key component of Marxism, because Marx, at least according to this interpretation of Marx, it's disputed, but according to this interpretation, he's saying technology is developing by itself. It's not individuals who are acting, it's technology that's developing. Another example is in the philosophy of Hegel. Again, this is controversial. He talks about a Geist or mind or spirit which is independent, which is a force developing through history. At least according to some ways of reading Hegel, it's not individuals. Geist doesn't refer to particular individuals, but it's a spiritual force that's acting throughout history. So again, if you take this interpretation of Hegel, this is very it is a controversial one, but you see this is a philosophy that violates methodological individualism. Let me give you another example of a principle that we get just by thinking about actions, or a particular kind of action that we know just by thinking about it, is supposing I'm making an exchange with you, say I'm trading, say, one orange for one ticket to a professional wrestling match. Well, why would this trade take place? Well, if I want the ticket to the wrestling match, I must value that more than the orange that I have. And similarly, if you have the ticket and you're willing to give it up to me in return for an orange, you have to value the orange more than the ticket. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to make the exchange. So each person is valuing more that values more what he's going to get than what he's giving up. So again, we see that this is true just by thinking about it. We don't have to look at various exchanges or do a poll of people and say, well, did you really value what you were getting more than what you were giving up at the time? It isn't that we've done experiments to try to find that out. We just see that it's true just by thinking about it. And this is a particularly important example because even though it seems, when I've stated it to be quite obvious, it doesn't seem like much doubt. Well, why would you make an exchange if you didn't want what you were getting more than what you were giving up? Throughout the history of thought, this has been a principle that hasn't been recognized. For example, according to Aristotle, an exchange involves an equality, and this became an extremely influential view. You find in Marx, this is a key assumption. He says, in order to explain what the price of a good is, what the exchange ratio between two goods is, we have to assume that there's an equality in this exchange, and then we ask, what's the basis of this equality? And he goes on to argue that the only basis can be equal amounts of labor time required for each commodity that's exchanged. So the praxeological principle that an exchange involves this double inequality, I value what I'm getting more than what I'm giving up, and if you're exchanging with me, you value what you're getting more than what you're giving up. This obvious principle has been denied by a great deal of thought, at least up until fairly recent times. You see, once we realize this principle, it enables us to really throw into question a whole key assumption of Marxism. Now, another example of an important principle is one that the law of association, that when we're thinking about exchanges, we can show just in, this is dealt with by other lectures, I think Guido Holtzmann is going to be speaking about this. We can show just by thinking about it that you can it can be to your benefit to make an exchange with someone, even if you can produce what you're getting more efficiently than the other person can. That seems like it couldn't be the case. Say, supposing let's say you're a very fast typist, or you can type things. It might pay you to have someone else do your typing for you, even though the other person isn't as good as you are. You can the basic explanation is that you're even better at something else, so it's more productive for you to do that other thing. So again, we can come up with this extremely important principle of the economics principle of association just by thinking about a particular kind of action, what's involved in an exchange. We aren't doing experiments about it, we're just thinking about it. Now, I now want to mention as you probably know, this view of method, this praxeological method, is extremely controversial. Most economists, at least today, I don't think accept it. And I want to discuss certain kinds of opposition to in the time I have left, certain kinds of opposition to praxeology and what Mises and other Austrians say in response to these. Now, the first one I want to talk about was the criticism formulated by the German historical school. Now, there were there were a number of people involved in this. I'll just mention two of them. There were others like Adolf Wagner, but I just want to mention two. Gustav Schmoller, who was both of these, and Werner Zombart, both of these were Prussian economists. Remember, Prussia was the largest and most powerful state in Germany. It doesn't exist anymore after World War II. It was abolished, but Prussia was the most important German state. And I'll tell you a little bit about each one of these. Schmoller was really an economic historian. He was very interested in collecting statistics about various commodities, and he would write books about this, historical accounts of particular prices. And he was the principal opponent when Karl Menger, remember Joseph Lerner was talking about when he had his Principle of Economics, Schmoller gave it a very negative review. He didn't like this book. And the whole name Austrian school was really, was kind of intended as somewhat an insult, because at that time, remember, Austria had been in history the leader of the German states. For hundreds of years, the Habsburg emperors, the ones who ruled Austria, had been the emperor, the head of the Holy Roman Empire, until its abolition in 1806. But so the Austrians were the traditional leaders of the German states, but Prussia was the up-and-coming power. And remember, there were the three wars of unification, which Austria lost in the second of these, the wars of unification, 1864 against Denmark, 1866 against Austria, 1870-71 against France. So by calling this view of Menger the Austrian school, was intended as a term of derogation. It was saying this is the not very progressive group. The Prussian school, the German historical school, is really the dominant, the new progressive trend. And what Schmoller had in mind is, in his type of economics, and Mises thought this was really the prime motivation for the whole school, was that Schmoller was very much a statist in economics. He thought that the state should really control economic development. And here he was the successor of remember Guido Husserl was talking about mercantilism. There were a group of mercantilists called the Cameralists, who Schmoller was in their tradition they were the 17th century, but they were saying, how could the power of the state be built up through economics? So they didn't like the view that there were universal economic laws. They opposed this. They said, no, the state can violate these laws. They can build up economic power through various measures, say state aid to particular industries, or particularly protective tariffs. One thing that the members of the German historical school tended to stress was that Germany could become strong by having state-encouraged monopolies through tariffs. And the way that they would encourage a monopoly was by having a tariff, you could generate an internal market for whatever the industry was, because people in Germany would have to buy the product, since the tariff would make the competition unprofitable. But once they did that, then the monopoly could make a lot of profit by selling to foreigners at very low prices. So you would have a way of building up firms this way. And Mises, in one of his best accounts of development of fascism, called Omnipotent Government, came out in 1944, stresses this very much. This was a key component of the historical school. So you see, they didn't like economic laws. They're opposed to the notion that praxeology has that we can come up with universal laws of economics just by thinking about them. Now, the other one I've mentioned was Werner Sombart. He was a later figure than Schmoller. He lasted through the early 1940s. And he was someone that Mises knew personally. They'd been friends at one time, but then they didn't get along. He had originally started off, Sombart originally started as a Marxist, but then he moved very far to the right, and he eventually supported the Nazis. He was famous, again, we have the same thing as in Schmoller. He was primarily not a theorist, but he would amass enormous numbers of observations, and he did a great deal of empirical research. It wasn't very systematic, but he was famous for coming up with enormous masses of facts. He had, for example, a book on luxury in capitalism, another one on the Jews in capitalism. He would just keep coming up with all sorts of facts. Now, what are the basic points that this historical school raised in trying to go against praxeology? Well, I think we can understand what the historical school was saying by situating the historical school within a larger movement that was very influential in Europe, particularly Germany in the 19th century, called historicism. So the historical school is part of this larger movement. And historicism would be this view, I think it's not altogether an implausible view. We can say when we're studying particular cultures, we can see ways that they're very different. For example, if we look at, say, how people dressed in Europe in the 18th century, it's very different from how they dress now, or particular kinds of music and literature are very different in past times from what they are now. So the historicism is the view that in order to study a particular culture, we have to take it in its full particularity. We can't come up with universal generalizations about it. We just have to study a culture, and we'll see that each culture, each historical period is different from the others. And so if we attempt to, we shouldn't try to apply kind of claimed universal principles that are supposed to apply to all these different cultures. We just study each culture separately. The German historical school applied this to economics. They said there aren't universally valid laws of economics. It may be true, say, in 19th century Europe that the law of supply and demand determines prices, but this might not be true in other cultures. So all we can do is investigate particular economic societies, and we can't really try to come up with laws until we've done all this empirical investigation. Now, supposing then, you imagine that the Austrian economists would say, oh, but look, can't we just get these universal principles just by thinking about the concept of action and what follows from them? We don't need to do this empirical investigation. We just know that certain principles are true. The historical school questioned this. They said, even these basic principles are just true for particular cultures. And if this view is carried to an extreme, as you find it in the 20th century historian Oswald Spengler, then you get a view that even the principles of logic aren't universal. People, it's claimed, in different cultures have different logics. And Mises called this view polylogism. I don't think it's one of his happiest coinages, but that's what he called it. So this would be the view that there are different logics. People use different types of reasoning. So what we would consider, say, deductions from action would just hold, say, for our culture, for people who had a type of logic that we did, but they wouldn't hold for other cultures, might use other logics. There were some anthropologists who said that primitive societies don't use logic, they don't accept the law of non-contradiction. There was a French anthropologist around the turn of the century, was also a philosopher, Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, who held this view, or at least in some of his works he held this view. Now, as you can imagine, Mises is not very enthusiastic about this polylogism. He says, well, if you said that other cultures use different logics, so this doesn't really apply, he'd like to see what these logics are. People don't really spell out what these allegedly different logics are, and he questions very much whether this really makes sense. Would we be able really to understand someone who was using a different logic? It seems rather that our logic, our concepts are integral to the way we understand the world, and if someone didn't use our concept, we would be baffled. We really wouldn't know what to say. Now, I shouldn't mention, Mises doesn't come up with an elaborate philosophical justification for this view. He doesn't say, well, here's some very detailed account of what's wrong with polylogism. But he just takes it as very obvious that it isn't the case. So I mention this because I think this is sometimes a misunderstanding people have of praxeology. People think that they're going into a philosophy class and they're thinking they're dealing with the problem of skepticism, as Descartes raised it, where you start off, you say, I have certain experiences. How do I know that anything else exists other than my own experiences? Can't I call everything into doubt? Mises isn't trying any project like that. He isn't saying, well, we're starting with certain things that I experience. Now, how do I even know there are other people? How do I know there's an external world? That isn't what he's not addressing the problem of skepticism. He's taking it as given that we're talking about real actions in the world, and he says at one point, well, if you said it didn't apply to other people, just try it out and you'll see it does apply. So he's not really concerned to have some very elaborate philosophical refutation of this view of the historical school. He just said it's really given to us that that the concept of action does apply. We can see it by just we see we couldn't make sense of the world without these categories. So this, as I say, was one of the main schools that was opposing praxeology. The historical school said, no, there aren't these universal universal principles. It's just everything is confined to particular cultures. And Mises rejected this. Now, the next one that I want to mention is the logical positivist movement. Now, the logical positivists were a group that was started by the Austrian philosopher Moritz Schlick, who was a professor at the University of Vienna, and he had a group, it was sometimes called the Schlick Circle or the Vienna Circle, who met with him. There were a lot of prominent philosophers in there. For example, one was Rudolf Carnap, who was actually German, who was studying in Vienna, was a member of that. He became a very important philosopher later. Another that Mises was a particular opponent of Mises was named Otto Neurath. Maybe I should have written him down also. Let me just, maybe I'll put another, do I have another page? I'll just put him down. Wait, is this? Well, I have to take this one out here. This high technology is hard to understand. Okay, so he was a particularly important. Again, these people, as I'll be explaining soon, had a different way from the historical school of questioning praxeology. And again, Mises was very suspicious of why they were doing this. And Mises noted that the members of the Vienna school, at least most of them, or many of them, tended to be socialists. Neurath was, in fact, I think had been a minister in the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which had been established right after World War I and lasted for a very short time. So according to Mises, really what this group, the Vienna Circle, was doing was coming up with views that to question praxeology because they didn't like the conclusions of praxeology. They didn't like the notion that there are economic laws that are, if you thought about them, would really show that socialism couldn't be realized. Rudolf Carnap, who I mentioned, was another one who was very pro-socialist. In fact, he got very upset when he found that Karl Popper, who's not a positivist, but someone who was somewhat connected with the school, he found out Popper was reading Hayek's Road to Serfdom, so he got very upset about this. He said, well, this book is obviously no good. He said, I'm not going to read it myself, but it obviously can't be any good because he's attacking socialism. So according to Mises, this whole group is really aiming at criticizing economics because they don't like the conclusion. Moritz Schlick, who was the founder of the group, is an exception here because he wasn't a socialist. I think he was fairly classical liberal in his views, but he was the exception. I should say, it's somewhat of a digression, but that's not going to stop me. Schlick illustrates some of the dangers of academic life. He once had an oral examination of a student, and the student didn't do very well in the examination. He failed, and the student was quite upset about this, and according to some account, he was also upset because he thought Schlick was having an affair with a girlfriend of his. So he became very upset about this, and he came into Schlick's office and shot him dead. This, I think, illustrates. I wonder now, when we have this, when they announce the results of the final exam on Saturday, I was thinking maybe I should come with a bulletproof vest just in case. So the way that how the logical positivists, how their views would go against praxeology is this. They said that when we're talking about knowledge about the world, let's say we're talking about new knowledge, things that we just have to find out, the only way to do this is through observation. Remember, I distinguish between knowing things through observation, through using our senses, and knowing things by thinking about them. They thought if we just think about things, that won't tell us anything new about the world. The only way we can acquire new knowledge about the world is by actually looking, doing experiments, trying to find out things. And they took this view to quite extremes. They had what they call the famous verifiability criterion of meaning. Now, you could take this either in a very strong or weak sense. Now, the very strong sense was, they said, the meaning of an empirical statement is its mode of verification. Now, this seems like a very strange view. For example, supposing I take the statement, Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. Now, according to the strong view, what that statement means is that if I were to go to various books on Roman history or various documents, I would find evidence for saying that Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. So I would find various Roman writers who would discuss Caesar's assassination. Of course, they wouldn't, if they were contemporary, they wouldn't be using the date 44 BC. Then they would be like the archaeologists, came up with the coin, Caesar's assassination. He said he knows this is authentic because it says 44 BC on the coin. But so, according to this view, the method of the meaning of the statement is its method of verification. Now, this as I say, this is an extremely implausible view, because when I say Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, it's obvious that what that proposition is talking about is something that happened to Caesar, not what would happen if I were to look at various documents. And again, as Bertrand Russell pointed out, in order to know how to verify a proposition, if I have to first understand what it means, I can't figure out how could I test, is it true that Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, unless I already understood what it meant. So it can't be that the meaning of the statement just is its mode of verification. But so I think the strong verification principle is out. But now there's a weaker version, which would just be that any statement about the world, any empirical statement purporting to be about the world, in order for it to be meaningful, we have to be able to give various observations that would confirm it. Now, it appears, at least at first sight, that this wouldn't lead to any trouble for praxeology, because couldn't we say, well, in some sense, suppose I say an action involves the use of means to achieve ends. Well, couldn't I just see various actions and we would see that people have various purposes in doing things? So we would see anytime there's an action, doesn't that mean this view is confirmed? So what's the problem? But according to the logical positivists, they said, no, you can't do it that way. If you have a universal statement of the kind that praxeology has, where they say all action, any action involves the use of means to achieve ends. If you're having something that you're claiming is necessarily the case, that we're saying this is a so-called a priori statement, it says we know that this, just by thinking about this is the case, that because this has to be the way it is, there couldn't be an action that didn't involve the use of means to achieve end. According to the logical positivists, this statement would be meaningful, but it wouldn't be telling you anything about the world. It would just be what they called an analytic statement. An analytic statement is one that is either a definition or part of a definition. Use the example they always give in these cases. Suppose I say a bachelor is an unmarried male of a certain age. You wouldn't say that a 3-year-old is a bachelor, even though he's unmarried. But so here, according to the positivists, this statement is meaningful and true, but it's just a definition. Just people have said this is what the word bachelor means. It isn't telling you anything about the world. It's just a statement of what the word means. And they claim that either analytic statements, the a priori statements, to be meaningful or analytic in this sense, they're either definitions or parts of the definition, or they can be laws of logic or instances of laws of logic. And they thought this laws of logic didn't convey any new information about the world. Wittgenstein, who wasn't definitely not a logical positivist, but was one who the logical positivists were close to, gives this example. He said, supposing someone asks you, is it raining? And you answer, well, it's either raining or it isn't raining. That's an application of a logical law of law of excluded middle, but isn't telling you anything. You don't really know whether it's raining just on that statement. So according to the logical positivists, all a priori statements are this kind of tautology. They're not telling you anything new about the world. They're just really laws of logic or definitions or parts of definitions. So they're not really telling you anything. So this would really, if their view was right, it would pose a problem for praxeology, because according to praxeology, we know all these important propositions about the world just by thinking about them. But according to the logical positivists, these are just definitions. They may be true statements, but not giving us any real knowledge about the world. Let me give you an example of the kind of criticism they gave. One of the principles that we have in Austrian Economics is that an actor will always choose his most highly valued end. Say if we have a choice about various things, we'll always pick the one we value the most. Well, according to the positivists, all that we're doing, all the Austrian economist is doing is saying that it's a linguistic proposal. They're saying they propose to define the most highly valued choice as the one that you in fact choose. So then, according to the positivists, well, then it must be the case you always choose your most highly valued end simply because you've defined the most highly valued end as the one you choose, so it isn't really telling you anything. Now, if we look at this criticism, I think we can see it's not right. It isn't that the Austrian economists haven't defined choice. They haven't defined the most highly valued end as the one you choose. Rather, they've taken most highly valued end in a very commonsensical way. They've imagined that, say, you're thinking about various things that you might do, and you think which is the one you would most want to do, and the claim is you would choose that one. So it doesn't appear to be a definition at all, so this criticism doesn't seem like it's right. And I think we can see more generally that there isn't really too much to be said for the logical positivist view. One thing that's wrong with it, this is probably the most famous criticism of the view, is that it doesn't appear to meet its own criterion for meaning. Remember, the logical positivists said, a meaningful statement has to be either an empirical statement, which is one that is, we can know by observation, we can give various observations that would confirm it, and in their view, all these empirical statements can't be ones that we say must be true. They're ones that could be true or could not be true. They're contingent ones. Say, is a contingent proposition, and also an improbable one, you're staying in the room listening to me. That might be false. You could not be here, so it's not one that must be true. So they said an empirical statement has to be of this form. It's contingent. It can be true and it might not be true. So they're saying a meaningful statement is either this kind of empirical statement or an analytic statement, which remember is a tautology or something that isn't giving us any knowledge about the world. So the problem is that this view, this verifiability criterion says that all statements have to be either these analytic statements that don't tell you anything about the world or empirical contingent statements, is itself neither one. It's saying, suppose you say, we can't, or taking it another way, suppose you say you can't know anything about the world just by thinking about it. Well, what about that very statement? That appears, if it were true, to be just knowing something about the world by thinking about it. What you're knowing is, it seems like an odd statement. You say, well, just by thinking about things, I can know that you can't know anything about the world by thinking about it. Somewhat of a peculiar statement. Now, another problem with the logical positivist is that it's just, supposing you disregard that objection, it's just a proposal. They're saying this is what a meaningful statement must have, these properties. But why? It's just a bare assertion. Why should anybody accept it? Supposing we said something like a meaningful proposition must be one that's contained in, somehow deducible from the book Human Action. Why should one accept that? It's just an arbitrary proposal. Very often in philosophy, you'll find people will be coming up, will say certain kinds, they'll come up with a certain fallacy, like they'll say, famous one with Whitehead, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, or people will come up with all sorts of fallacies, but they don't say why these things are wrong. They'll just say, well, this is committing this fallacy, you're guilty of fallacies. Logical positivists say, well, you're not making a meaningful statement if you claim that there are certain propositions that we know just by thinking about it that gives you real knowledge of the world, but it seems like what they're saying is arbitrary. Now, just one thing I will mention, supposing you found the logical positivist views, in spite of everything I've said, you find them appealing or convincing, you could still, one defense you might give of the Austrian Praxeology is to say, well, even if these are tautologies, these are useful tautologies. They may, if the positivists are right, they may not give us knowledge about the world in the sense that it's implicit in the concepts that we have, that all the theorems are implicit in the concept, but still they're a surprise to us. We're learning things just as, say, the logical positivists thought mathematics is composed of tautologies, but still we seem to learn important things with new mathematical theorems. This is Leland Jaeger took this view. He holds that we could just say there are certain tautologies that are useful. Now, there are some indications that Mises was sympathetic to this view, at least in some parts of Human Action, although elsewhere in some of his other works he takes a more robust claim that there are these propositions are giving us knowledge about the world. They're not just analytic in the way the positivists think they are, and I think that's the more plausible view. On the few minutes left, I want to mention one other view that's used to criticize the Austrian method. And I thought when I mentioned at the start that Hans Hoppe usually gives this lecture, I think it's a particularly good feature of his lectures that he devotes some time to this other writer, and I'm going to do this, Karl Popper, who's the last one on the list. Now, Popper was not a positivist, but he knew the positivists. They didn't like him very much. In fact, one member of the related group in Berlin, Hans Reichenbach, who was very closely associated with logic positivists, wouldn't shake hands with Popper because he deviated so much from correct positivist doctrine. But Popper is important to mention because his views are very influential among many economists. Milton Friedman was very influenced by him. So what Popper said was, instead of talking about a criterion of meaning, he wanted to say what is a criterion for something to be a scientific statement. So according to him, a scientific statement must be falsifiable. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, supposing we take in a scientific law, we say something like water consists of H2O. Well, how do we know? How do we know, say, if we've we've analyzed various samples of water, find they all come out with H2O? How do we know that the next one we have will be H2O? I'm going to put aside questions on involving definitions of water as H2O. I'm just taking water here to be the colorless liquid that we drink, saying, how do we know that's H2O? Just from the fact that all previous samples of this liquid have come out to be H2O, it doesn't logically follow that this one is going to be. This is the famous problem of induction. How does it follow? It doesn't logically follow, it's not deducible from all the past observations that this rule will hold in future. How do we know this? So this is a very great many philosophers have written on how we justify induction. Popper's radical step was to say, we don't need to justify induction. We can get rid of induction. All we need to say is that we have a certain hypothesis that, say, water consists of H2O, and then we can test it out. And in order for it to be a scientific statement, it has to be falsifiable. We have to say this water's H2O is falsifiable because, say, we analyze the liquid and say it just came out to be HO, then it would be false. Then that principle would be false. So this is it's criterion for scientific statements. Now, praxeology doesn't do too well according to this test because, well, you say action consists of use of means to achieve ends. Well, if praxeology is right, there couldn't be an action that didn't involve use of means to achieve ends, so the statement can't be falsified. So then it's not a scientific statement. Now, Mises, in reply to this, says, well, first of all, this is in his Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science, very important book, 1962. He said, well, first of all, why should we care about whether a statement meets Popper's criterion of science? I mean, we might care if a statement wasn't meaningful, but why should we care if it doesn't meet this particular criterion? Rather, we should take science to mean what actual scientists have come up with, and given that economics is a discipline, we should use a criterion of science that allowed it. Now, I'll just mention one other criticism of Popper to conclude with. On this falsifiability criterion, it really eliminates a lot of our knowledge. It isn't very plausible. For example, suppose I say there's intelligent life somewhere in the universe, and we assume the universe is infinite. Then that can't be falsified, because no matter how many planets I look at that don't have intelligent life, it appears I wouldn't be able to show that the statement is false, that intelligent life exists somewhere in the universe other than on Earth. But it clearly appears to be a scientific statement. So Popper's criterion would lead us to really complete skepticism. So these are a few of the important criticisms of praxeology that so I think really they don't hold up very well. So thanks very much.